this issue than they were earlier, but the shift is not reflected in high school textbooks. This finding might reflect the fact that there were little revision since the first edition printing of these textbooks. For example, the American Pageant, many might or may not realize, was originally published in 1956. And is now in its 13th, actually it's in its 14th edition, which recently came out after I've already completed my analysis. Now I didn't do an analysis of all those textbooks across, but in many cases, from just tertiary, but just anecdotal and just brief review of earlier editions of the same textbook, you find that what changes most often is at the end. A new presidency, 9/11, things of that nature in the more recent history are added in, and previous information is not really corrected or other than egregious, where terms like Negro or colored are removed. Other than those sorts of changes, the majority of it stays pretty much intact. For example, in the American Pageant, which is the one I seem to be beat up the most, but I don't mean to, but actually I do mean to. It cites for giving the overall numbers of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. It cites, I believe it's David Northrup's work from the 1960s as a source for the table that it created, and the numbers actually show that the British were the largest perpetrators of the slave trade, and not the Brazilian or Portuguese. So immediately it's giving you misinformation because it's using something from nearly 50 years ago, a source from nearly 50 years ago. As I mentioned before, the timeline in the U.S. is something that came across. I didn't realize it until I started looking at the Brazilian textbooks, which almost none of them have any timeline, except for one in an introductory pages has a timeline. In U.S. textbooks, you'll find timelines at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of every chapter, at the end of every chapter, and in many cases in the kind of the supplemental additional materials. The timeline is present, is omnipresent throughout the textbooks. And what's interesting about that is when I was formulating this idea of a singular linear phenomenon, that it just moves across, I think the timeline reinforces that. Now, there are uses of timelines. I'm not just critiquing timelines at large, but I think it does begin to shape. So when people hear years, they immediately put the year as it relates to U.S. history. So if you ask Americans 1865 or 1863, immediately Civil War comes to mind. If you say 1776, immediately the Revolution will come to mind, not maybe a case or any other history outside of the U.S. It's so ingrained those years. But I put out this timeline because I couldn't wrap my head around it. This was also from the American Pageant. It says 4,000, and this is the first chapter. And in no way in the text of that first chapter they reference this timeline. But they say 4000 BC, recorded history begins. 4 to 8 BC, Jesus born. And then 1607, Virginia founded. And in the text, it does not really explain not just why it chooses this lineup of things, but it doesn't relate. I don't understand it at all. And so I just present that as kind of seeing the over-reliance of timelines, of a problematic timeline in this case, but yeah, it just jumps over a whole lot, and I think there's some. But this is one of the benefits of comparative research is phrased as a window and a mirror. I like to use the idea of when you look into another context, especially another national context. I'm both an outsider and an insider in this study. I'm an insider because I grew up in the U.S. I was educated in the U.S. I'm an outsider to the Brazilian context. I will start to notice things in the Brazilian context that an insider won't, and vice versa. I won't be able to notice things in my own context, deep in the forest sorts of idea. And this timeline, they're so second nature to me that timelines are always there. You put up timelines in middle school, you always put up a timeline, a family timeline everywhere. And in the Brazilian ones, you just didn't see that timeline. Now, it doesn't mean it wasn't chronological, but it just didn't mean the stress of the timeline wasn't there to the same at all. So, to the Brazilian one, unlike the U.S. authors, the authors of the Brazilian textbooks included more global history within the national history narrative. 3 of the 4 Brazilian history textbooks included the words geral, general, within their titles, and 1 used global. And the last had a broad subtitle, Das Cavernas do Terceiro Milênio. My accent is a little off, forgive me, I haven't spoken Portuguese in a little while. Roughly from caves to the 3rd millennium, right? However, the textbooks were not world history books, in the sense that they attempted to cover all of human history across the globe. The authors instead incorporated particular world historical events and topics from ancient history to modern history as they related to Brazilian history. Nearly all of those particular events and topics included were from European history. For example, all of the textbooks had full chapters devoted to Greek and Roman history, as well as the French Revolution. In addition, the regions of Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Oceania were not discussed in Brazilian textbooks until the chapters covering the 20th century. So that was one of my points of comparison between these 2 sets of textbooks, is that these are the national narratives that are being presented to their generations. Yes. So, to the findings. It was clear from the graph that both the US and Brazilian textbooks had particular patterns in terms of the references to slavery under specific spheres of history. For all books, the emphasis on the political and social aspects of slavery, the emphasis was on, the political and social aspects of slavery. You can see these are the averages across all 8 books. The US are the darker ones, Brazil are the lighter ones. Those are the average number of references per textbook. Oh, a point about scale. I didn't include this, not scale, but about the size of the textbooks. The US are often known for tomes. They're on average between 11 and 1,200 pages, including all the additional material, but about 11 to 1,200 pages, roughly about 35 chapters long. The Brazilian ones range closer to about 400 to 600 pages, with one which was a 3-volume set, which totaled just about 900 pages. But the number of chapters actually were closer to 58, in 50 to 58 in each of those textbooks, and they actually felt denser. The paper felt denser, so there still was a sizable piece of an artifact for not only the student to carry, but to turn to telling the story. For the Brazilian textbooks, although the political and social spheres were the 2 categories with the highest number of references, there was more explicit attention to the economic history of slavery in the Brazilian ones than in the US. In the US textbooks, the religious references to slavery were the most common of the cultural sphere across all of the books. For all the US textbooks, the religious references were confined to the chapter on social and religious reforms during the 19th century, if you recall the table of contents. I found that in the Brazilian textbooks, religion had the most number of references, but that the number, on average, accounted for about half of the cultural references. For example, in Historia das Cavernas, the one with 3 volumes, 23 of the 40 cultural references were related to religion. The majority of the religious references focused on one of 3 topics. First, the African religious practices that enslaved Africans carried to Brazil. Second, the role of the Jesuit missionaries and the colonial system of Brazil. And third, the fusion of Catholicism and African rituals among the enslaved, specifically Candomblé. The other cultural references were more general in their relation to the history of slavery, most often with statements such as, I'm going to read the translation that Daniel was helped me to, because my Portuguese is a little sloppy. Spread throughout the country, African cultures are part of the way the Brazilian population is, thinks, and lives. In the same way, the labor of Africans and their descendants also mark the Brazilian economy throughout its history, in the past and in the present. This theme that various aspects of African cultures have influenced and permeated Brazilian culture through the experience of enslaved Africans appeared in all 4 Brazilian textbooks. In both the US and Brazilian textbooks, one similar finding was the discussion of the importance of a particular crop in driving and expanding slavery in each nation. In the United States, the expansion of cotton in the Deep South increased and further entrenched slavery into society. In Brazil, sugar and later coffee dominated the market for enslaved Africans and affected price and trade patterns throughout the Atlantic world. Both sugar and cotton, and to lesser extent coffee, tobacco, and rice, were mentioned in all 8 textbooks as having importance to the expansion of slavery in respective countries. However, in the US textbooks, nearly all of this discussion was focused on the domestic importance, with only a passing mention to England being a major market for Southern cotton leading up to the Civil War. Brazilian textbook authors presented a slightly more global view of sugar's role in slavery and the slave trade, although not in any great detail. In the US textbooks, economic references to slavery were a distant third to political and social spheres of history. The economic systems reference focused primarily on the colonial plantation system in the United States, and later on the difference between the northern commercial and industrial economy and the southern agricultural economy. However, the majority of these references were only surface descriptions of the economics of slavery in the US. For example, in none of the 4 textbooks did the authors explain that although the North and South had different types of economies, the 2 systems were inextricably linked together by slavery. Northern markets traded and manufactured Southern raw goods, insured slave ships and enslaved people, and thus benefited from the slave economy. The narrative surrounding these individuals was one of, if I look at the personal category, which was an interesting point in that the US textbooks highlighted individuals related to the issue of slavery, either enslaved persons or those abolitionists. In the Brazilian context, very few people, actually Zumbi was really the only enslaved person who was discussed at any length. There were names who were mentioned, who may have become later writers, but they were just mentioned. You just saw their name there. There was no description about them, no context. The narrative surrounding these individuals was one of, in the US context, of extraordinary people leading others in the cause against slavery. What I did not find were prominent individuals who overtly and actively supported slavery as presented in the textbooks. The textbook authors would either mention that a person was a slave owner, but not whether they called for the expansion of slavery, or mention that, for example, John Calhoun was a supporter of states' rights and not explicitly a proponent of slavery. Groups such as planters or slave owners were most often identified as advocates for the maintenance of slavery rather than any one person. This pattern of highlighting the individuals who fought against slavery and not individuals who advocated for slavery aligns with the theme of American progress. In other words, the individuals highlighted are all those doing good work, and I use that loosely, as opposed to the groups, the unnamed, impersonal terms of planters, owners, etc., who were the proponents of slavery. And I think that fits within that ethos of American progress.
Nafees, you have about 2 minutes left.
No problem. No problem. I want to jump to, excuse me, this part. The complexities. In all 8 of the textbooks, women's experiences under slavery were given minimal attention. However, unlike the authors of the other textbooks, The American Pageant did explicitly state that enslaved women were in, quote, constant fear of sexual exploitation by predatory masters. They wrote further in this section that in a later chapter, that women had multiple responsibilities that included the harsh physical labor of plantation life, raising the children of their owners, and taking care of their chores for their family. Nevertheless, the tone of the entire text placed slavery on the margins of U.S. history. Similarly, in the Brazilian textbooks, only the Historia das Cavernas made an explicit mention of the sexual abuse against women, and in that reference only stated that abuse existed. In the same textbook, the authors also mentioned that the colonial government allowed relationships between European men and indigenous women to increase the forced labor population through reproduction. This was in spite of the increase of Portuguese women arriving in the colonies. Nonetheless, neither of these references to women during slavery went beyond a single statement about abuse or reproduction. In the few passages of the standard U.S. history textbooks that did address enslaved women, the authors highlighted experiences of individuals. 2 prominent African American women were who were directly discussed in connection with slavery were Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. Although these two women have tremendous historical and symbolic importance in American history, their stories, as presented in these textbooks, do not reflect the common experiences of enslaved women. And for the sake of time, in summarizing the level of complexity presented in textbooks, across all the textbooks in the study, the omission of a discussion of the unique experiences of enslaved women presented an incomplete and problematic view of the history of slavery. The coverage of the enslavement of Native Americans and indigenous people in South America was limited in the U.S. textbook, but more extensive in the Brazilian ones. And lastly, the misleading and inaccurate statements about the demographics and economics of slavery in both sets of textbooks decontextualize the presentation of slavery from the history of each country, as well as restricted the complex history of slavery. And I'll just close. As you can see, I have more findings. There's a lot of implications. Okay. This is where I'll end. Yes. In this study, I identified an overall narrative of progress across the U.S. textbooks through the analysis of slavery. I found that the ideal for American society as presented in the textbooks is based on the ideals written in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, i.e. liberty and freedom. In other words, the goal for society is already spelled out and it is up to the people of society, to allow it to come to fruition. Thus, U.S. history, with all its brutal and controversial history, remains a singular linear phenomenon progressing towards the utopian ideals from the founding documents, an inevitable force of history. In the Brazilian textbooks, I found a similar progressive narrative, but was not tied to specific ideals written down in any founding documents of Brazil. Since its independence in 1822, Brazil has had 7 constitutions, the most recent of which was written in 1988. I found that the narrative of progress was presented in general as part of a historical, economic, political, and social processes of society. History of the Brazilian textbooks was slightly less rigid than compared to the U.S. textbooks in terms of a singular linear phenomenon. It was still chronologically progressing towards the present, but the lack of timelines in the Brazilian books implied a slight difference in the temporal stress of Brazilian history. In particular with slavery, the textbooks presented the view that there was an economic inevitability to the end of slavery, therefore diminishing the role of actors in shaping society. And lastly, as seen in the Brazilian law requiring the inclusion of Afro-Brazilian and indigenous history and culture in the recent apologies issued by the U.S. Congress, Brazil and the United States still confront the legacies of slavery to this day, and how a country teaches the current and future generation about the past reflects the attitudes, values, and beliefs of that society. It is critical for students to gain historical understanding and empathy in order for them to become informed citizens. The topic of slavery is not only a useful means for helping students develop historical thinking skills, but also can offer perspective to many social issues confronting contemporary society. As one of history's great injustices, the topic of slavery remains an enduring and controversial issue, with legacies that transcend many contemporary concerns that include, but are not limited to, race, class, gender, and identity. Thank you.
Thank you to Nafees. And to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jessica Millward, who is Assistant Professor here at UCI in the Department of History. Her research centers on early African American history, comparative slavery and emancipation, as well as women, gender, and the law. She's author of the forthcoming book titled Charity's Folk, Enslaved Women in Freedom in Pre-Civil War Maryland, which is going to be published by University of Georgia. It's part of their Race in the Atlantic World Series. She also has a second project titled Moving Freedom, Citizenship, Migration, and Resettlement in the Afro-Atlantic from 1775 to 1865. Her work has appeared in a number of publications, including the Women's Historical Review, the Journal of Women's History, and the Journal of African American History. And her research has also been supported by a number of different foundations and organizations, including the American Association of University Women. And she received her PhD in U.S. History from UCLA. Jessica. Yeah, this is you.
This is the benefit of having a...
I'm sorry?
Not totally dark, just leave that one dark.
I won't make it as dark. That's what you're saying? Excellent.
So the benefit of having a moderator who is also an art historian is she sets the stage for you. I didn't have to do anything with the machine or anything. Okay, first of all, let me thank you all for joining us this evening. Let me start by saying good evening, because it is now good evening. Good evening. So I know that we are supposed to end at 6:15, and this is my home institution. I'm Alex's colleague, so you would think I would be beautiful. You would think I would have better manners. But if I learned anything at UCLA, Professor Alpers, is that we do not concede our time.
Right.
It just simply doesn't happen. So I'm thanking you in advance for staying to the end of the presentation. This is not the first time I've been dead last on a program, obviously. So seriously, I should actually never have an open microphone, because at one point I thought of being a comic, and it didn't work out well, so now I'm a historian. Let me just sincerely thank Alex Baruchi. I was on the committee which hired him. We had very tough criteria. You had to do very good work, and you had to be an agreeable colleague. And those were very tough criteria, but also very hard criteria to match. So he has blended in with our department seamlessly, and now my only claim to fame, we were actually part of a two-part hire to diversify UCI and the research that we do. And so my claim to fame is I was on the search committee that hired Alex Baruchi. So we're very pleased to have him. Thank you, Thomas Parham, Professor Parham, for ushering in a particular spirit that actually sets up this session very well. And again, thank you for all staying until the end. So today's research is based on my manuscript, which focuses on manifestations of freedom among enslaved women in Maryland. It started as a project actually very long ago. Professor Alfers was on my prelim committee. So this is how the story ends. When the study was supposed to be about Baltimore. But one of the things that happened is I was continually drawn to Annapolis, and two documents in particular, which I will get into in a minute. So the larger project focuses on about 1,500 manumission documents from Anne Arundel County, Maryland, which is basically the home seat to Annapolis, the state's capital. And we've had a very full 2 days of looking at, expansive histories and micro-histories. Today I'd like to take what is the remaining time and talk about the social implication of some of these numbers. Look at the Atlantic slave trade from what I'm continuing to call more a story of hope. Sharon Ray was with me when I presented this paper in Ghana. Sharon allowed me to go with a group of students and her to Ghana a few years ago, and they asked me to lecture on the Atlantic slave trade. And, as you know, there's a heavy weight with going and doing this kind of work. And I instead wanted to leave our guests, or our hosts in Ghana, with the story of what happens after people leave Ghana. So, by way of introduction, this woman, Charity Folks, was the subject of a manumission document that I found. She introduced herself in roughly about 2000. She introduced herself while I was doing work at the Maryland State Archives, and for almost a decade, I had only 2 documents on her. But she still managed to find a way into every presentation I gave. She found a way to make it into class lectures that I gave. She was this persistent presence. So many historians believe that they actually choose their subject. They believe that they actually go into the archives and they stumble on a great letter or what have you, and they thus have chosen what they'll write about. I actually happen to believe that the subject chooses the historian. So that's where I'm going to start the story today. And what I want to have in the back of, what I want you to have in the back of your mind is this quote from Professor Wationgo, who is on faculty here, who says, "But African memory does not disappear quietly into that good night. It mounts resistance in both the African continent and the diaspora." Charity Folks is a ghost of slavery who refuses to be silenced. She finds herself in the company of Margaret Garner's beloved daughter, the young girl known only as Cecilia Slave, Sarah Bartman, Sally Hemings, Sojourner Truth, Queen Nanny, and countless unnamed others who haunt historical memory precisely because they carry the weight of the diaspora's traumatic past. Collectively and individually, their lives testify to the multifaceted legacies of enslavement. They testify to the attempts by captives to dismantle it, as well as the attempts to suppress its most violent and horrific truths. Their recovered past, these ghosts of slavery, their recovered past underscore the competing interests involved in remembering, constructing, and commemorating the lives of enslaved women specifically, and Black women more generally. So Charity Folks is not as well known as the bondwomen who I mentioned, but she is just as present. So I had these documents about Charity Folks, these 2 documents, and in these documents, there was a document from 1797 where it lists the fact that Charity Folks and several of her children were going to be freed. 2 of her children would be freed with her. The other 3 children would remain in bondage. Then the story picks back up again in 1807, where she enters court for what I thought was only the 2nd time. And so she manages to secure the freedom of not only her children who were still enslaved, but also grandchildren who had been born within the 10 years. So what I had in my hands were 2 documents of a Black woman negotiating for her own freedom well before the Civil War and emancipation. I mean, this in terms to spread our definition of liberated Africans. We're engaging in a process of self-liberation at this point. So that's where I thought the story of Charity Folks ended, with just these documents. And I waited a decade, and it wasn't patient waiting, it was a lot of days flying back and forth to the Maryland State Archive, wondering what I was missing. I lived in Maryland for 3 years to do this research. Surely I had everything I needed. But there was this nagging sense that I was missing something. So I stepped back for a moment, and I had a conversation with a friend who in some ways just reminded me of why I became a historian, and it was to uncover these lives of people that are often forgotten. And so with that, I actually did a little bit more research, and I contacted, actually Daryl's colleague at the University of Maryland. I contacted Mark Leone, is he an anthropologist? He's an anthropologist by training, but he does historical digs around this city of Annapolis. And he actually does digs on property that actually happened to be owned by Charity Folks' descendants, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So he puts me in touch with people in the community. We as historians sometimes, we are hesitant to actually ask people on the ground what stories are. So he put me in contact with a few people in Annapolis, and within 2 weeks of these kind of phone calls, I actually found myself in the house that Charity Folks was not only enslaved in, but also lived in actually she worked in after she was freed. Okay, so this is how the story begins. It's in some ways, once I knew how the pieces fit together, public memory and history all collided at once. They both, in some ways, the story started literally unfolding in real time. So there's actually, now there's becoming 2 parts to the story of Charity Folks. There's the story itself, and there's actually the story of getting to this point. In essence, Charity folks has been forgotten for many reasons. One, the fact that Baltimore often commands the attention of anyone studying slavery in Maryland is one issue. The other issue is she comes to life during this period of the American Revolution, and historians are really only looking for African Americans during the American Revolution if they happen to be the men that follow Lord Dunmore's proclamation and try to join up with the British. So there's really not a space for someone like Charity Folks. But Charity Folks, I found out, she wasn't content with being invisible. So today, to this lecture and kind of the larger project responds to this call to be remembered. And that's when I invoke Ngugi's words about African memory not going quietly into that good night. So in the small study of the larger study, I argue that despite a presumed presence in the historical record, Charity Folks and countless enslaved women like her not only shaped the history of early revolutionary America, but actually, if we retrain our eyes, their imprint is quite visible. Finding Charity Folks has at this point spanned almost 2 decades. It includes oral history interviews, reviewing collections and published family history papers, obviously reviewing some 1,500 manumission documents, and research in archives and museums across 3 continents. Now, one of the reasons someone like Charity Folks escapes our memory is that because public memory, especially public memory of slavery in Maryland, or enslavement in Maryland, is almost exclusively associated with 3 figures. Kunta Kinte, I'm serious, Daryl, am I telling the truth?
Sure.
Kunta Kinte and P.S., the 40-year anniversary of Roots, the mini-series is next year. So Kunta Kinte, and I don't have the pointer, but this last picture down here, I guess to your right, is the memorial to Alex Haley at the dock of Annapolis, because Kunta Kinte actually disembarks in Annapolis before he's taken to Virginia, okay? The other figure, of course, is Frederick Douglass. We have, the top row is the house that Frederick Douglass lived in Baltimore, and then a larger monument with just his head, and then we have down here Harriet Tubman. So,
Thurgood Marshall's the other thing.
I forgot Thurgood Marshall.
He's a pretty big one.
He's a big one. He's a big one. Not my century, however. So Charity Folks did not meet Kunta Kinte, Frederick Douglass, or Harriet Tubman, yet her life actually overlapped with them in key ways. Believe it or not, Kunta Kinte is inextricably tied to Charity Folks through John Rideout. Sorry, this one's going ahead. I had to, in effort of time, I'm not sure if my slides are going to catch up with me. So, Charity Folks is inextricably tied to Kunta Kinte because her owner, John Rideout, owned the ship that carried Kunta Kinte from Africa to Annapolis. And in fact, when the ship docked in Annapolis, it was actually within a block and a half of the house that Charity Folks was enslaved in. They both were around the same age. They were about 12 to 13 years of age, both when the man we know as Kunta Kinte was kidnapped and brought to America, and Charity Folks was about the same age when he arrived. Now, we know they probably didn't meet each other. But what she could see from where she lived, which was in John Rideout's house, what she could see from the house that she lived in was probably the docks. And she often probably witnessed the human cargo descending ships, the bows of ships, and being carted off to the courthouse or what have you to be sold. So here's Frederick Douglass.